Welcome to Babel, Translating the Middle East, a podcast from the Middle East program at CSIS. Here on Babel, we take you beyond the headlines to take a closer look at what's happening in the Middle East and why it matters. This week on Babel, I speak with Mohammad Shabani, editor of Amouage.media. Together, we discuss Iran's regional strategy and the choices Iran has after a year of rising regional tensions. Then I continue the conversation with Martin Pimentel and Will Todman to discuss what the new U.S. administration will mean for Iran, its conflict with Israel, and its relations with the United States. To translate some of what's happening in the Middle East, this is Babel. Mohammad Shabani, welcome to Babel.
Thank you for having me.
It feels to me like everything that's happening in the Middle East now is really happening in the shadow of the attacks of October 7th of last year. From an Iranian perspective, what are the regional impacts of that attack?
I think there are vastly different viewpoints of what happened and the effects and meaning of it. I think from the outset, one camp viewed the attack as heralding some kind of strategic victory for Iran in the sense that it helped preempt or delay, at least, Israel's southern normalization. On the other hand, there was another camp, I think the more dominant one in Iran, which were more interested in pursuing some kind of understanding with the United States. And their key strategic aim is to secure a semblance of sanctions relief, to put an end to the maximum pressure campaign that was imposed by Trump and continued by Biden in many respects. And just before October 7th, in late September, the two sides were finally moving towards really resuming some kind of negotiations, indirect, to achieve an understanding. And then October 7th happened, which made it politically very difficult, if not toxic, for the Biden team to be perceived as dealing with Iran. So there are a variety of viewpoints in Iran. Some view it as at least initially positive. Others see kind of a disaster in the grander scheme of things because the big fish for them is sanctions relief.
And it feels like the chief pressure point that Iran had was Hezbollah, and Hezbollah seems infinitely weaker now than it did a couple of months ago. People were talking months ago about the deterrent impact of Hezbollah and 150,000 rockets and missiles trained on Israel. And Israel seems to have dispatched a lot of Hezbollah's capacity and decapitated a lot of Hezbollah's leadership. And Iran has neither been able to respond effectively nor come up with an alternative. Does that also sound right to you?
There were a lot of misperceptions over the past years. One, I think, misperception was this idea of Hezbollah and Israel being peers. Even in the months after October 7th, some Lebanese analysts you would speak to had this idea of Beirut for Tel Aviv formula, at least in their minds. And now we see that Hezbollah cannot directly confront a national military that at least over the past 12 months has received almost 23 billion US dollars in aid from the United States, right? So there's a disparity there. Then again, there's another viewpoint that Hezbollah is now really going back to its roots, to its origins, which is to fight an invading force. And this is where they're most comfortable. I was just on a conversation the other day, and they were saying how difficult it is to contact members of the organization. It's not like before. So over the past decade, with the intervention in Syria, we've seen a ballooning of Hezbollah, of its size, of its operations, making it more vulnerable to infiltration. And Israel, what it did was to manage successfully, as we saw in the pager operation, to carry out intelligence operations that previously were not possible. Partly because when the organization was smaller, when it was operating mainly within Lebanon, it was much easier to maintain rigid standards of internal security, of vetting, etc. Those things slipped. So with reference to Hezbollah, does it have the same capabilities it had only a few months ago? Obviously it doesn't. Of course not. Does it serve a deterrent value for Iran? I think yes. But I think this is, again, another misperception. And that is rooted, I think, in the different views of war in, let's say, the West versus the non-West. And I saw somebody tweet something really smart about the different perceptions of war. And he was saying that Western-style warfare is shock and awe, to see these images coming out, huge blows that are very visible. Whereas the non-Western view of war is much more attritional. So I think it's about how warfare is viewed, its time frame, the nature of it. And I think one of the reasons why Hezbollah has not hit back as hard as many would have expected it to is probably because its perception of the timeline of war is different from what many assume. And this is the input that I think many analysts are now getting from the ground, that initially you had the decapitation strikes, you had the pager attacks, you had the walkie-talkie attacks, but those were kind of one-offs, right? How many times can Israel set off capabilities to injure 3,000 members of an organization in one go? Now that we're seeing the mounting death toll of Israel in the field, we're seeing more and more footage coming out that ground fighting is very different from intelligence operations, from aerial strikes, etc. And the input is that they're settling in for a long war. And in this long war, while Syria, for instance, was previously, I would say, a liability, it may come as an asset now because it offers Hezbollah increased strategic depth. And not just Syria, also in Iraq, many Hezbollah families have moved to Najaf. They moved to Baghdad in recent months, right? So I think the notion that Hezbollah is on the back foot is accurate. But then to go a bit deeper and think, does it have the capacity to, in a significant manner, attack Israel, including major urban centers? I think absolutely. And I think that goes back again to the deterrent formula from the Iranian perspective.
You talked about a sort of Western concept of war, Eastern concept of war. After the Israeli strikes in Iran, the Iranian leadership seemed to advertise a Western type of war response, that Israel would feel something immediate. It felt like it was leaning more toward something on the symmetrical side, which could leave Iran in an escalation problem with Israel. Are you surprised that the Iranian leadership seems to be addressing a challenge from Israel in that sort of urgent, rapid, demonstrative way, rather than taking the longer-term view that you just said is more typical of Middle Eastern and Eastern approaches?
If we look at recent history, over just the recent decade, in Syria alone, I think Iran had absorbed hundreds of attacks, hundreds of aerial assaults. So the IRGC absorbed these blows because they saw it as exercising strategic patience to build up capability for that one day. The way Israel, I think, has conducted itself since October 7th shows that the previous formula, they want to change it. They want to change the rules of engagement. And I think Iran has been quite reticent to go along with that. Obviously, doesn't want any other side to write the rules of engagement. The Israeli operations have also compelled Iran to move away from its preferred method of warfare. And in this respect, many analysts have pointed out that whereas the axis of resistance, the name Iran has come up with for the regional alliance network spanning from Iraq to Lebanon to Syria to Yemen, it was meant to act as a forward defense to provide Iran with plausible deniability, to keep the conflict outside its borders. But the way Israel has conducted itself is that it is compelling Iran to move towards this more Western shock and awe style of kind of warfare. And we've seen this in operations True Promise 1 and True Promise 2, when we had hundreds of ballistic missiles, drones fired at Israel. But again, they were calibrated not to kill. I think there's only been 1 or 2 casualties from both of these incidents, and they were non-combatants within Israel. So I think now Iran is kind of stuck in this formula where it's fighting a war, number one, that it doesn't want to fight. Number two, in a manner it doesn't want to fight. And number three, if it doesn't fight it the way Israel does, it will be left exposed in a difficult position both at home and before its regional alliance network. So I think probably some of the conversations that are being had in Iran right now are that essentially fighting this war with these big displays of missile power, drone power, in a direct confrontation is probably not to Iran's benefit for a variety of reasons that I just outlined. And also essentially because in this game, Israel likely has the upper hand. For the same reason it has the upper hand when it comes to Hezbollah, because it is backed by the world's sole superpower, almost unlimited resources, whereas Iran is not equipped on the same level. So then the question arises subsequently, what kind of confrontation would suit Iran better, and what can Iran do to change the nature and manner of this confrontation back to the terms it prefers. When it comes to ground fighting, things look very different. Then the question arises of, okay, well, how can Iran engage in that? It can send forces to Lebanon to be embedded with Hezbollah, which is probably happening already. It can mobilize its regional alliance network to open up a second front in the Golan Heights in Syria. We have seen already the presence of Iraqi fighters, Yemeni fighters who have been killed in Lebanon. So it's a question of how coordinated would such efforts be? To what scale would they be conducted? And has Iran made the strategic decision, which I think it has a capability to do, to turn southern Lebanon into Afghanistan for Israel? And it hasn't decided to do so because I think Iran does not want an expansion of this conflict. I think everything we've seen from Iran since October 7, from the upper echelons of the leadership, is they do not want to be engaged in direct war with Israel. They do not want an expansion of the conflict in Gaza. They failed to stop it from being expanded. They certainly did not want to see the current situation in Lebanon, which has included, as you pointed out rightly, the decapitation of the organization's leadership. So I think Iran is stuck with very difficult choices at present.
But it seems like Iran wants to be in a battle with a better equipped, I would argue, much better trained adversary, seem to at least strategically support the Hamas attacks of October 7th, and then say, well, it doesn't really want to be in a war with Israel. I mean, I don't understand how you can have those two things. On the one hand, build up this axis of resistance, which is going to target civilians, and on the other hand, say, can't we all just get along?
I see your point about the inherent dichotomy there. I think the question that needs to be asked is, what is the purpose of the axis of resistance? I think for Iran, at least, the purpose of axis of resistance has been forward defense, to protect the homeland. There has been a lot of debate about the extent to which Iran may or may not have been involved in October 7th. So far, the intelligence points to Iran not having been involved.
Tactically, but strategically, yes. Tactically, no, right?
So it has been involved in providing Hamas with the capabilities to attack Israel. And we're talking specifically about things like technology transfer and training of personnel. But being involved in making a decision that ultimately has put it in this position, I would dispute. Because I don't see October 7th as having served Iranian interests for the number one reason, which I outlined previously, which is that they want sanctions relief. For them, that's the big picture. To have a single assault by Hamas doesn't really serve the core Iranian objectives. The core Iranian objective, I would argue, is to have some kind of understanding with the United States. And I think from the Israeli perspective, at least the way things are viewed in Tehran, is that Israel views this relationship with the US very much in zero-sum terms. That for Netanyahu, for a very long time, his main objective has been to prevent Iran-US rapprochement. So I think if you zoom out and you take all of these things into consideration, and you ask the question, did Iran want October 7th? I would say absolutely not. But then, as you rightly point out, then you say, well, hold on a second. They've been supporting Hamas all this time. But supporting a group doesn't mean that they can determine in minute detail these actions. This axis of resistance can both be an asset and a liability. So many are arguing now that, hold on a second, this regional alliance network that you've been equipping, that you've been trying to coordinate, was meant to be forward defense, to keep conflict out of your borders, out of your soil. And the exact opposite is happening. So this axis is actually inviting conflict towards Iran. And there's a lot of criticism then of the current setup inside Iran. There's debate on the deterrent value of the axis. And then naturally, then the other question that arises is, if this regional alliance network cannot provide forward defense, what can we do to achieve primary defense, right? So this primary defense is very limited in terms of its ability to compete, again, with a country that's receiving almost unlimited military political support from the United States. The $23 billion figure that I mentioned previously, it's almost 5 times Israel's usual allocation, about $3.8 billion a year. To put that figure in perspective, that's double Iran's annual military spending. Double. Iran's population is 8 times that of Israel. So in these terms, what can Iran plausibly do to achieve some kind of military balance? And if we have this situation with the Axis not providing the forward defense that many had argued, and if we additionally add your point about Hezbollah not providing the deterrence, there's only one natural conclusion: nuclear weapons. And this is where the discussion in Tehran is headed now.
Or, arguably a different conclusion is to end the conditions of war that have been in place between Iran and many countries, including the United States, since 1979. That's also an alternative.
You have to look at things from the Iranian perspective. They are now stuck in a conflict with Israel that they do not want, I think. And the way Netanyahu is behaving, he's doing everything he can to get this conflict. They can't stop him from pursuing this conflict. And if you're saying that Iran should change its conduct since 1979, that would mean a complete reorientation of its foreign policy aims.
And as you've pointed out, Iran has backed itself into a corner where it seems to be fighting losing wars and sanctioned and having a weakened economy because it is committed to this zero-sum game with Israel, which has a stronger economy, the backing of the United States, and the presumption of nuclear weapons.
My bigger point is that this notion that, Iran, it could just simply eliminate its foreign policy posture and then everything will be resolved. I think it's more complex than that. And I think even if you have a successor state that less of the current ideology, you will probably end up in a similar position. As I argued previously, I think prior to October 7th, in September 2023, there was really a push for engagement with the United States. October 7th negated that, made it far more difficult. And I think that was not something that was welcomed by Iran.
So if Iran wants to both sustain the axis of resistance as long as it can and get closer to having a nuclear weapon because this forward defense no longer seems effective, how do you get from those two positions to anything that looks like de-escalation with the United States?
Right now, there are a variety of camps in Iran that are pursuing different aims at the same time. This may sound very diffuse, but I'll be very specific. Keep in mind, in Iran, nuclear weapons have been taboo. The Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, has gone out with a so-called fatwa banning their use and stockpiling, all of those things. Now, senior officials are increasingly going out and saying that we can build nuclear weapons, and the reason we don't have nuclear weapons is because of political decision. It's not a technical obstacle. I think they want to try to use the leverage of a threat of a bomb in a way that we haven't seen before to achieve this de-escalation. Obviously, things can backfire. And the way I see things, increasingly, it is moving towards nuclear weapons. I don't see this happening under Khamenei, though it's probably going to happen after Khamenei, partly because of the fatwa he seems so wedded to. This is one camp. At the same time, there's another camp which is arguing to achieve our aim. We need engagement with the West. Even amid the current escalation with Israel, even now, as we speak, there are voices in Iran, including the president, including the head of the central bank, and the vice president, arguing that, hold on a second, our number one priority right now should be the economy. They're talking about ways to, for instance, remove Iran from the blacklist of the FATF. They're arguing that as long as Iran is on the blacklist of the Financial Action Task Force, it's not just about Western sanctions making it basically impossible to engage in any kind of meaningful commercial trade relationship with Western countries. Also, it's making it very difficult for Iran to engage with China and Russia. There are many experts who are in the industry in Iran who argue that one of the main obstacles to trade with China is FATF. So these are not mutually exclusive processes. There are different camps in Iran which are pushing and pulling to go in different directions. And there are even some who are trying to thread the needle by having these debates about nuclear weapons being made increasingly public and going out and saying it's not technical, it's a political decision. And in this respect, I should also point out essentially that the camp that is not in favor of nuclear weapons argue that by pursuing such capabilities, essentially a nuclear arms race will be initiated in the region. And at the end of that arms race, what will happen is that Iran will, through the nuclearization of the Middle East, lose the advantages inherent in its geography and its demography, etc. So there are a variety of viewpoints, but your point about how do you compute the diverging tendencies right now, one in favor of weaponization of the nuclear program, looking at the region, looking at the axis, looking at forward defense, on the other hand, seeking kind of de-escalation. It's very difficult.
Where do you see power devolving in Iran? The Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei is 85, although seems to be in relatively robust health. He's still 85. One hears increasingly about the Revolutionary Guard emerging as a sort of Praetorian Guard taking power, the clerical establishment diminishing in influence. If that happens, does that create a moment of flexibility? Is there a more transactional leadership that Iran becomes less ideological, more interest-based? Or, in your sense, does the Revolutionary Guard have its own ideology relatively consistent? And I would imagine some people think that Iran, with stronger Revolutionary Guard voice in leadership, would actually be more combative because of its ties through the Quds Force to all sorts of axis of resistance movements throughout the region. If we look at a 5-year horizon, what do you think we should be looking for in terms of foreign policy direction and how power is distributed in Iran?
The question of leadership succession is always looming large. Of course, the million-dollar question is what happens when Khamenei goes. I think nobody really has an answer. To that, we do have some insight into how leadership succession is meant to work, but nobody really knows the details. Nobody knows the list of names. There are a variety of ways that Iran can move forward. One aspect could be that simply another leader is named, and then those who go down that route argue that either there's going to be a strong leader, somewhat similar to what we have now, or that the Revolutionary Guard, and I would caution the notion of the IRGC being a monolith, but still, let's say the Revolutionary Guard is a somewhat coherent entity, would prefer somebody weak, a weak leader that's more easily influenced, more easily managed. That's the argument about replicating what we've seen so far since 1979, which is to have a single supreme leader. Another argument that's been made repeatedly over the past 20 years is to change the institution of the guardian jurist, the Wali Faqih, and turn it into a council. And when you turn it into a council, then the question arises of who's going to be part of that council, which political faction will be represented. There's even talk about, well, hold on, maybe existing institutions can be reformed, right? So let's say the Supreme National Security Council, the current top decision-making council, which gathers the country's civilian and military leadership, can that be reformed in some kind of way to be turned into a leadership council, right? So then the argument can be that if you go with a council model, you will have more stability because obviously there's more decision makers involved. You become more impervious to any high-profile assassination attempt, etc. But if you zoom out even more and we look at the bigger picture here, at what direction is Iran really moving, and this goes back to what I argued previously. I understand this notion that Iran under the monarchy was fundamentally completely different. I would argue that if you look at the real underlying core aims of Iran in the region, on the surface, the ideology may seem different, but I think the interests haven't really changed. And some people in Iran see Iran going full circle. So what do we have under the Shah? There's a secular government, secular state, basically pursuing a form of nationalism with a Muslim identity. And what we're seeing in Iran is kind of a return to that, where the state is more nationalist and less interfering in people's personal lives when it comes to things like religion. So I'll give you an anecdote. At least in Tehran, in the capital, based on what I'm hearing, in the past 2 months or so, this state has completely given up on hijab enforcement. It's gone. It's mind-blowing that people ditch the veil, walking out with crop tops, at least in northern Tehran, and the so-called guidance patrol are doing nothing. Outside Tehran is a different question. And for me, at least, these scenes are shocking. But I've seen the amount of resources they put into things like hijab enforcement. So if the state is moving towards increasing nationalist predisposition, if they're moving towards less enforcement of religious affairs, private religious affairs, we're really going back to the Shah's era. So What I mean by a nationalist predisposition is that in Iran, increasingly, we have what they call an Iranian Islamic identity. That Iran is seen as distinguished from other Muslim states, that there's a very strong nationalist, pro-Persian component to it, Shia component. At the same time, there is an Islamist nature of the state ideology. And they're trying to find a different way. How will this spell out in terms of foreign policy orientation? So I think if they can find a way to coexist with other major powers and then negotiate at least informal understandings that allows them to expend more of their energy within the country's borders, that's a win-win for everybody. Do I foresee post-Khamenei Iran signing a grand peace deal with Israel? No, probably not. But does Israel want that? Does Israel need that? I think not. Probably they're happy living with some kind of cold peace, a kind of understanding that this is our domain, this is your domain, and we're going to find a way to not be at each other's throats.
So as a final question, let me ask about the Israel question, the regional question. Regional states seem to be simultaneously exploring closer ties with Israel, at least in the medium and long term, and some sort of reduction in tensions with Iran. We saw Saudi Arabia doing naval exercises with Iran, which is mind-blowing. Is this a sustainable trend? Is this a trend that Iran actually wants to encourage, as some of your comments might suggest? Or does this just represent hedging on the part of Gulf states who are hedging between Iran and Israel, between the United States and China and Russia? Is this just one big hedge?
I think that's a very good question. Many see Saudi Arabia's maneuvering towards normalization with Israel in the context of normalization with Iran. And the conclusion they're drawing is that MBS calculated that to be able to normalize with Israel, he first needs to normalize with Iran. So they see what you're saying, element of hedging. There's also an understanding of MBS as being in many ways an inward-looking actor, somebody who's again, nationalist leader who has a number one priority, and that priority is Vision 2030. And at any expense, he will pursue it because he sees it as vital to the interest of the kingdom and its future. And this is why he has become much more flexible in Yemen, where he's willing to live with the Houthis, he's willing to live with Iran. With reference to how Iran views these developments, as I said previously, there was a camp in Iran that viewed October 7th, at least initially, as a win because it prevented Saudi-Israel normalization, which was viewed as very negative. But there's also other camps in Iran which see the bigger fish being some kind of understanding with the United States, that they see sanctions relief as the number one objective. So zooming out again and asking you your core question here being that how do Iran view the kind of Arab-Israel normalization process, the longer-term trend in the coming years? I think they do see Saudi Arabia moving towards some form of understanding with Israel, but they see normalization with Iran as a prerequisite for that. So it's not going to be a net loss for Iran. They see the Gulf countries feeling exactly as you pointed out, stuck trying to hedge between the major powers, Russia, China, US. They also see Turkey, they see Iran, they see Israel. And I think for at least the Saudis, one really key moment, which shaped a lot of their current behavior, is what happened in September 2019, when the oil facilities came under attack. And this notion that the US was committed to Saudi security, they would rush in and help, it didn't materialize. And they were stuck on their own.
And that was, of course, an Iranian attack on Saudi Arabia, which Iran initially denied and said it was the Houthis.
They denied. There's a dispute about where the missiles were actually even fired from. The point here being that the US security commitment didn't, materialize. So this is partly why they now want to have stronger commitments to the defense of the kingdom. Point being that they see these chips moving and they see a lot of hedging, as you rightly point out, but I think they also understand that there's a realization among the Gulf countries that they can't change their geography, that even though they may not like Iran and its current state, its political system, they have to find a way to coexist with it. And I think one pioneer in this regard has been the UAE. When Trump left the Iran nuclear deal in 2018, they cheered him on. 3 years later, They're among the first in the GCC to reach out to Tehran. MBS followed, right? So I think there's an aspect of hedging, but I think really there's also a different understanding of regional dynamics and the limits of US commitment. And this changes things a lot because they understand the US is not going to be there forever. From their perspective, I think from anybody's perspective, if you look at things rationally, there's not really much in the Middle East for the United States. The number one priority for the United States has always been China. That's the peer competitor. If you look at the region, there are not really crucial core US interests there. Right now, even oil, even people who kept being stuck on oil, the US right now is a net oil exporter. The main export of Saudi Arabia is the oil price, right? So I think calculations in the region are changing.
Mohammad Shabani, thank you very much for joining us on Babel.
Thank you for having me.
Knowing that a Trump administration will be coming in the new year, how do you expect both allies and adversaries of the United States in the Middle East to act in the next 2 months? Do you expect there to be anything that they're going to try to get out of the way or to prepare for?
I think certainly there will be an effort in Israel to take care of unfinished business in Lebanon. It's not clear how they're going to think about Iran. It's my sense that as Netanyahu looks forward, he's going to see a much more permissive U.S. attitude toward Israeli actions toward Iran in the coming years. And so it seems to me that he may hold off, even if Iran tries to respond to the last Israeli strike. There's a part of me that thinks Iran will want to get something over with Israel while it's under the Biden administration. But exactly what that'll be, I'm not really sure. The last 2 times that Iran tried to strike out at Israel, it seems to me that both efforts were quite unsuccessful. So I would expect some sort of Iranian effort that will be in the asymmetrical camp, whether it's in cyber, whether it's some sort of terrorist attack that's a little bit deniable, whereas some people in the CIA sometimes call it implausible deniability. I think we might see something there. Again, I think that the main action will likely be with Israel being more aggressive in Lebanon, perhaps being more aggressive in Gaza, with a sense that they might want to present an opportunity for Trump to broker an agreement early in his term.
Yeah, I think it makes sense for Israel to try to curry favor with Trump by preparing the ground for some early wins for the incoming Trump administration. And certainly Trump has expressed a desire for the wars to end in Gaza and in Lebanon. The degree to which he's likely to wield real leverage on that is unclear, I think, at this stage. But I certainly would expect Israel to be quite dismissive of any efforts from the Biden administration to put real pressure on it to change the course of action in Gaza or in Lebanon. We have the 30-day deadline coming up that the Biden administration placed on Israel to facilitate greater aid access to northern Gaza. When that deadline is passed, I wouldn't expect Israel to have made real progress on it. And I don't think they will feel under much pressure from the Biden administration to actually do that. In past lame duck periods, we have seen outgoing Democratic presidents taking some steps against Israel. President Obama didn't veto a UN Security Council resolution that criticized Israel. But I think all of that is undoable. So I don't know that Israel is too concerned about those kinds of moves.
And just to say on a personal level, there's a Biden theory of the case that as a 50-year supporter of Israel, he would demonstrate his connection to Israel, his attachment to Israel, his commitment to Israel, and it would give the United States greater leverage over Israeli action. And I think what we're seeing, especially as Will points out, with this sort of deadline that was intended to give Netanyahu space to do what the United States want him to do, it feels like the whole theory of the case that Biden had for U.S. influence with Israel has collapsed.
I think the other actor to watch here is Saudi Arabia and what happens with talks over a Saudi-US defense agreement. To me, that seems unlikely that would reach the treaty level. That would require 2/3 of senators to vote for that. And I wonder if that's really likely during the next 2 months. But certainly, I think Saudi Arabia is going to be thinking about what they can get out of the Biden administration. Having decoupled such a negotiations over normalization with Israel, Can they get to a better position there? Is that something that the incoming Trump administration would be supportive of? How would Donald Trump push Republican senators to vote on something like that? Or if he's really supportive of it, would he prefer that to happen when he's in office?
And on that, I'd expect something small and incremental.
Yeah.
So the Biden administration can take a win, but not so large a win that Trump would feel that he had been upstaged. I think Trump wants to be the one that moves forward on that.
How would you expect the renewal of Trump's doctrine of maximum pressure would shape Iran's strategy toward Israel?
I think Iran is feeling very vulnerable at the moment, and I would expect Iran to go into survival mode and not conduct some kind of big flashy attack on Israel, as John just said. To me, the idea of plausible deniability is probably something that will dominate Iran's strategy against Israel for a while, taking the idea that Iran can strike back at Israel at the time of its choosing in the manner of its choosing. And so that might mean some kind of targeted assassination or some other irregular or asymmetrical tactics. But I don't think that necessarily is going to come soon. I mean, we still are seeing Iranian efforts to avenge the assassination of Qasem Soleimani over 4 years later. And I think Iran could well take time to feel in a stronger position before it takes a stronger step against Israel.
It seems to me that the Iranians don't have a lot of good choices. Their economy is weak. They're feeling that the whole strategy of the axis of resistance has been really set back by what's happening in Lebanon, and they may lose a significant foothold in Lebanon that really sets them back. Their instinct has been to negotiate with the United States. I think they've been advertising that. They missed the window with Biden, with Raisi presidency, and now Pezeshkian, I think, has clearance to explore something, but is not going to find the U.S. very interested in the near term in exploring. I think what the Iranians are likely to do is some low-grade misbehavior, but on the Iranian side, it seems to me that misbehavior is the preview for negotiations, and that the way the Iranians prepare the ground for negotiations is by saying, okay, we'll stop the misbehavior. The challenge is how they don't fall into a spiral of confrontation with the Trump administration, which is really committed to tightening the screws on Iran. I give this about a year or more of rising tension. And then I think there will be an effort on both the U.S. and the Iranian side to explore if there is a senior level, very senior level, which is to say the president, option to negotiate something with Iran the same way he explored negotiations with North Korea. I don't think that comes soon. I think there is a sense that Iran will be in a much weaker position when that starts. And then the question, of course, is where we are in the nuclear file. And it's not beyond the realm of possibility to me that the Iranians think the way to get the negotiation with Trump is to advertise or to achieve more progress on the nuclear file as the way of forcing the negotiation.
Given that Israel has inflicted significant damage on many of Iran's regional proxies over the course of the past year, how do you think that will affect these negotiations over the nuclear file in particular?
I don't think there's any unanimity in Iran on how to approach nuclear issues. I think there's a sense that it's a card to be played. I think they may be getting to a point where they're going to have to make a more definitive decision on whether they're playing that card. You have to remember that nuclearization in Iran is not an event, it's a process. I mean, first you have to demonstrate the ability to explode a warhead. You have to be able to put it on a missile. You have to make sure the bomb doesn't explode on takeoff. So I think there's a window there, which may be a window for negotiation, but you also have to keep in mind that you have an Israeli government that is going to feel increasing protection from the United States to act against Iran. And to me, the challenge is if you have these sort of two parallel fronts, you have a U.S. president who sees himself as a negotiator who conceivably could negotiate directly with the Iranians. You have an Israeli prime minister who feels that this is not only a once-in-a-generation chance, but a once-in-history chance to take decisive action against an Iranian nuclear program with American support, and may have an instinct to act. And how those two work, whether they work in parallel, in coordination, in contradiction, I don't know, but I see those two possibilities. And for Iran, that means that the range of outcomes is starkly different and profoundly important. Of course, the other element to keep in mind in all this is the supreme leader is 85. And some of this may be unfolding amidst an Iranian leadership transition.
And ultimately, the challenge for Israel, if it were to try to launch military strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities, would be, can it take them all out? And given that the Iranian regime at that stage would have made the political decision to go forward with it, how do you stop them from trying again and again and again? And can you maintain that deterrence? There's been a lot of analysis I've seen about the idea that it's not just the physical sites, but it's also the knowledge. It's the political will to actually go for it. And my understanding is that Israel doesn't have the level of bunker busting munitions that would be probably required to get some of the deepest underground nuclear facilities, but the United States does. So under a Trump administration, if Israel truly takes the decision to launch these strikes, it would need not just US tacit support, but probably overt support for that. And that's a really risky proposition. And then when Iran is truly feeling that it's an existential fight, I think it could go in really quite unpredictable directions.
And you have an American president who's committed to not getting involved in wars in the Middle East. And so that's another calculation. Of course, let's remember that Israel was on board supporting the U.S. with the Qasem Soleimani assassination and then backed out at the last minute. So the record of joint U.S.-Israeli cooperation against Iran under the Trump administration is not a solid one, but it may be in the coming years. I mean, it's a period of remarkable uncertainty, especially so for the Iranians, who are facing increasing social discontent, a weak economy, and a president who is determined from day one to increase pressure rather than waiting a little bit into his term like he did before. And I think the Iranians are in a much weaker position than they were on the first day of the first Trump administration.
Weaker with Europe, are generally more internationally isolated, but one really interesting actor to watch in all of this will be the Arab Gulf states. I think that's really the only international win that Iran has had in recent years, is normalizing with many of the Arab Gulf states. And the coming of the Trump administration will really test that. Those ties are shallow. They are not deep. They're not reinforced by deep economic ties or anything like that. And so can President Trump now peel off the Gulf states from Iran once again and get them on board with a strategy of maximum pressure on Iran? I think that's a question that will really be interesting to watch.
And they, of course, fear that if there is greater conflict with the United States, that they may be the near inconvenient target where Iran hits back, again, with implausible deniability, as it did at Abqaiq and Khurais in 2019, where under the previous Trump administration, the U.S. sat on its hands.
Yeah.
So it's a whole series of difficult calculations, and I think a very important space to watch over the next 4 years.
John, Will, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marty. Thanks for listening to Babel. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the podcast on iTunes or Spotify or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can find more analysis on this topic linked in the show notes on the CSIS website, and you can find us on Twitter at CSIS Mideast.